Hey guys, welcome back to yet another episode of SAFT Apologetics, SAFT podcast. And it's been a long time since I've been back on
Yep.
the podcast because there has been a lot happening at my end. But I'm really glad to be back with you all and with you, Jacob. It's been so long. Nice to see you. You're, as always, looking evergreen, handsome. And okay, let me ask you this question. I've been wanting to ask this. What's the secret behind this, Jacob?
Well, first of all, let me start off by saying to the audience that we are testing out a new recording setup. So, which is my audio is suboptimal. So, kindly forgive us for that. We will resolve this within the next episode as well. That being said, there isn't. The audience might be thinking right now that these guys are supposed to get into casual conversation, not cringe conversation. So there isn't any secret to the way I look or how I look. I mean, if I were one punch man, maybe I would have said stuff like, "Oh, the secret to whatever there is would be 100 sit-ups, 100 push-ups, 10 kilometers runs and stuff." But I'm the one punch man, so yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't believe that as well. So, yeah,
So yeah,
yeah,
Piyush. So you're joining back after a while, and so what we were doing in the last episodes, as you know, and so just to recap for audience also, we started our dialogue into the Kalam
yeah,
Cosmological Argument. It's something that you know quite well. You've seen me talk about it. You know how I like that argument. So we started our Natural Theology talk into it, and Piyush, let me ask you this: What is this? What
yeah,
is the Kalam Cosmological Argument? And by that I mean, how do you
yeah.
state the argument?
Hmm. So basically, Kalam cosmological argument it has three premises, and the first premise states that whatever begins to exist has a cause.
Right.
The premise two it states that the universe began to exist. Okay, and the third and the final premise it states that therefore the universe had a cause.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So one thing I want to point out right off the bat is that the column doesn't have three premises; it has two premises and a conclusion. So the last part is the conclusion. That is what we are moving towards, and because the thing is, like you said, with deductive arguments, right? The Kalam cosmological argument is a deductive argument. We know that the argument is valid if the premises are true. So if you say the last thing, the universe has a cause, a premise, then by necessity of the argument, if that is a premise, it has to be true. But then what are you arguing for in the first place? So it cannot be, when you think about
right.
it, it cannot be premise, it is the conclusion. And the other thing is also, when you
Mm-hmm.
formulate the kalam, it's essentially quite interesting that you formulate it that way, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Because I've always said, everything that begins to exist has a cause. It is there is no difference out there, but it just shows you that philosophers can take different wordings, different styles of presenting the argument while sticking with the same thing. And the Kalam also has that interesting part to it because of the nature of it being the deductive argument, where you could say that we can rephrase the Kalam cosmological argument to say premise one: if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Premise 2, the universe
Right.
began to exist. Conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause. So we just modified premise 1 slightly. From saying everything or whatever that begins to exist has a cause, we just said, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. And we said, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So even Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Craig, who has been, like we mentioned before, the pioneer mind behind Kalam in our current age, he said that this sort of reformulation of the Kalam, what it helps is that it doesn't get into sort of off-topic discussions on what happens at a subatomic level in terms of quantum fluctuation and all that stuff. Because you're not talking about everything that we do, you're just talking about the universe part. And the defense of premise one that we normally see with the normal version of the Kalam would still apply there. Because the principle at play, the the principle of cause and effect at play still holds. It's just that you have reworded the argument in such a way that you are not allowing any person to get off to off-topic questions on, what would happen in that scenario, what would happen in this scenario. We're just talking about the universe. So it
Right.
gets the point done. So it's just one of the flexibility that comes along with these sort of sophisticated philosophical arguments.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think that was pretty clear. And I mean, of course, like you and Steven did a great job in the previous episode,
Yeah.
and I did make my notes. So there's one thing which you both touched upon. It's about what is possible, what is probable, and what is plausible. So can you just, repeat what's the difference between these three?
Yeah, it's yeah, it's very important that you brought that up. So in the last episodes, it's sort of like a recap of what we touched on. We talked about the terms cause and nothing. So we looked at what do we mean by the term cause. What are the different types of causes that Aristotle identified? So we specifically talked about efficient cause and material cause. And we also highlighted why having that distinction in mind is very useful when you're talking about the universe having a cause. Because then again, the reason we distinguish is that so that when you get to a certain point of the discussion, people will say things like, "Oh, well, how does God create the universe out of nothing?" The Kalam doesn't say anything of that sort, and you will get into that creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, theological dialogue there. So at that time, having this distinction would come into play, and also identify the difference between material and efficient cause. You can refer back to our last episode for an in-depth exploration, a simple layperson's in-depth exploration on that. This distinction also helps to bring to effect much more powerfully what it means to say that something can come from nothing. What it means to say that something can begin to exist without any cause. And then we looked at the term nothing, what that means, and what we understand of the term nothing to mean. And if we understand the term nothing in its proper sense, what is the implication to say something can come from nothing? Now, when the atheist says, something can come from nothing, what is the proper implication to it? Now, in that dialogue, Stephen off the bat asked me, what is the difference between um, probable and plausible. And so I was immediately thinking of a good example to bring that to effect. And I realized that I didn't do a great job in outlaying that. So it's good that you asked about this distinction, especially because I've also talked to
Yeah.
you earlier about possible, plausible, and probable. Stephen asked about probable and
Hmm.
plausible because that's what we were discussing about. So these three terminologies, right?
Yeah.
Possible, probable, and plausible. All right. Now we have very much heard about the term possible, because we use that quite frequently, even in our common
Right.
Indian English usage. You are learning engineering, I am learning economics, so we obviously come across probability and stuff. I think we've come across this very clearly when we
Yeah.
were in our 11th and 12th as well. Probability calculations.
Yes.
In economics, in statistics and stuff, we learned about Bayesian probability calculations and all that stuff. So probable was also a term that we would learn in school and we would otherwise use as well. But then plausible is something quite distinct that we don't use the term plausible, even though the concept behind using the term plausible is part and parcel of our usage. We we don't use the term plausible, but we use the implications of that when we're talking about things happening or not. Um, so the interesting thing with possible and impossible, right? The first part, possible, is that there are two types of impossibility. One would be what we call a strict logical impossibility, and the other would be a metaphysical impossibility. Right now, as soon as Piyush, as soon as you hear that, you're gonna wonder what is this guy going all about. So let me bring that to effect. So when we say something is strictly logically impossible, it would be equivalent of saying a married bachelor or a square circle, right? These things are strictly logically impossible because they are inherent
Okay.
contradictions. They cannot be
Hmm.
possible,
Hmm.
right? And in a strict logical sense. Now, one example, so this is strict logical impossibility. When you say something is metaphysically impossible, it doesn't mean that there is a contradiction in there. There doesn't seem to be any inherent contradiction like married, bachelor, or square circle. But one example I see philosophers point out is an object with size but no shape. Well, there isn't a logical contradiction there, right? There isn't a logical contradiction there, but it immediately strikes us as impossible. We're talking about a metaphysical impossibility there. We're not talking about a logical impossibility. Now, we may use the term logic and logical very um, quite simply. so that it may strike us as the same thing, but when you get into the nuances of the terminology, that's quite different. So, or here is much another easier example, and I hope this works out. Imagine you're trying to build a single story apartment. So, not a multi story complex or anything, you're building a single story apartment. And
Okay.
the purpose of that apartment is to house 7 billion plus people in that apartment. So it's a single story apartment.
7 billion.
Yeah, one single story. And let's say you have
Wow.
only one floor, one room per floor. And that one room you can house one family. Let whatever be that size.
Okay.
So you immediately see that even though there is nothing logically contradictory in that concept, it strikes us as an impossible thing to do. It is metaphysically impossible to achieve. So this is sort of the distinction that would come into play with when philosophers talk about things like Hilbert's hotel. So a hotel with infinite rooms, an infinite number of people turn up there. Well, there's nothing logically
Yeah.
impossible there, like a married bachelor or a square circle. But then you get into the nuances and when you get into the weird details, into the weed of the details of what happens when an infinite number of people check out of hotel with infinite number of rooms, then it starts bringing up problems as such. So this would be the distinction of what is strictly logically impossible and then metaphysically impossible. So strictly logically impossible would be an impossibility of contradiction inherent to it. You cannot actualize it in reality. A metaphysical impossibility doesn't deal with strictly logical impossibility. There is nothing contradictory out there, but it is impossible to bring it out, really out there in reality, because of the constraints of that concept. So, like say, an object with size but no shape. Again, there is nothing inherently contradictory out there, but then how do you get an object with size but no shape? That's impossible. In what sense am I saying impossible? Not logical, metaphysical. So I know this may be a bit over the top it was a bit over the top when I first learned it. But then, this is how we get to learn stuff. So there is no shortcut around it to put this across. And the second would be probability. So now probability has to do with the numerical part. It has to do with numbers. It has to do with our background information. And it is, because it has to do with numbers, it is something that you can calculate. And an example would be winning a lottery, right? Seems pretty straightforward. You can calculate that if there are 1 million people taking one lottery each, and you are one of that persons, then your chance of winning the lottery would be something like 1 in a million. Numerical based, calculatable, and all that stuff. Now, if we have background information that over the past 10 years, the even number lotteries have been selected 90% of the time, and you hold an even number lottery number, then that background information will modify what our probability calculation is going to be. Because that information is going to be part of our information data set, and that is going to influence how we calculate probability. So probability is very straightforward, a numerical concept. It is calculatable. It can be quantified. Plausibility is not. Plausibility has to do with terms like likely and unlikely, reasonable and unreasonable, and as such. So when we say, and it has to do with more of the logical grounding that we share, as in not as much as a similarity with probability, even though logic undergirds everything. When we say something like, can something come from nothing? We're not talking about the probability of something coming from nothing. We're talking about how likely is it, how reasonable is it, how sensible is it to say that something can come from nothing.
Yeah.
And this thing varies from people to people, which is why, me and I would believe that you as well believe that we both would find it difficult to say that the moon landing was fake, right? Because of all the information data set that we have of the historical context of that, how that happened, the fact that it was a race between the US and the Russians, and that it seems pretty obvious, and it was a clear-cut race, right? It was a clear-cut race between the cosmonauts and the astronauts, the Soviets and the US.
Yeah.
And so the US were trying to fake the whole thing without ever actually going to the moon. It seems to be immediately that the Russians would call out on that bluff, right? Because they're going to say, you guys didn't make it there, we're going to make it to the moon. And it's a matter of huge national pride. So that is one of the reasons, and there are many other reasons that we would say it is highly unlikely. it is highly unreasonable, it is highly implausible that the moon landing was fake or that the earth is flat. So we're not talking about probability calculation there, but what strikes us as reasonable. And it is for the same reason, and I think I mentioned this in when I was talking to Stephen also on the podcast, that this plausibility part, appeal of plausibility, the appeal of something being reasonable or likely or plausible, will vary from people to people. So when we present an argument, like especially when we present an argument from resurrection, all that stuff, there could be a
Yeah.
genuine reason why some people may not be convinced. Um, no, maybe no, I'm not talking about the entirety of the argument, maybe with some details of the argument. Because when you put together the argument, it's really hard to denounce the resurrection part. But maybe with some details of it where it doesn't strike them as plausible. Just like there are no, honest, genuine people who think that the moon landing was fake. Because the data set before them strikes them as much more likely. And it isn't quantifiable, so we can't, in some objective sense, appeal to their intellect. So, yeah, so these are the three distinctions. I know we have, I think, about 5 minutes left with our bite-sized podcast section. But this is the distinction that I wanted to bring to effect in our last discussion. And when we're talking about the arguments here, obviously all of them has to be strictly logically possible. They cannot have contradictions in them. Sorted. And they have to be plausible as well. They have to be reasonable as well. Which is why we mentioned that when we're talking about deductive arguments, when we say everything that begins to exist has a cause, that's a statement. The opposite of that would be things can begin to exist, let's say, without a cause. Okay, let's put it that way.
Without a
Yeah. So
yeah.
things that begin to exist has a cause. The opposite would be things that begin to exist need not have a cause. Now, our burden is to show that this first part, things that begin to exist have a cause, is true, more plausibly true than the negation or the opposite part of it. So, if I say, something cannot come from nothing, and the other person says, no, something can come from nothing. Well, what strikes us more plausible? What strikes us more reasonable? What is more likely? What is more sensible? It immediately strikes us, and when we go through the arguments also, which we will look into hopefully in the next episode, that something coming from nothing is not possible, is more sensible to affirm. That something cannot come from nothing, that seems more sensible. It is more sensible than what? Why am I using the term more? It is more sensible than what is the opposite part. Something can come from nothing. And so we have to pick and choose between these two. And the first one strikes us as more reasonable, more likely, more plausible, and therefore that is what we affirm. This is something that we do in our daily life, right? It is much more plausible, much more reasonable to hold that I really exist, that Piyush, you really exist, that you are a real person who I am interacting with in this actual reality. The opposite would be that, I'm dreaming this stuff, you're not actually a real person, I'm dreaming this interaction. Maybe science is doing
Yeah.
some sort of weird experiment in my mind, or the holograph theory that, or the simulation theory of how what we're experiencing in reality is not really reality, it's being simulation done by some higher species and all that stuff. Well, what is more likely to hold? What is more reasonable to hold? It immediately strikes us that holding that what we experience as real is more likely to be true. And that is the reason that we hold on to it. Not because we have 100% certainty, not because we have answered every single objection that the simulation theory or the hallucination, let's call it that, the reality of hallucination theory brings about. It's not because we have answered every single question or every single possibility that may raise up, but because we are more reasonable in holding what we know to be reality than all of that
Right.
opposite side of stuff. And that's a sensible thing to do. And so the same thing that we appeal to when we get into the argument for why something cannot come from nothing, why everything that begins to exist has a cause. And then when we get to the premise too that the universe began to exist, we are appealing to philosophical and scientific arguments. So one immediately follows the other, and you get to the conclusion that, what is the conclusion, Piyush?
Uh, I mean, actually, I didn't quite get you. Can you please repeat?
Okay, if you tell me that you do not get
Yeah.
what I've been speaking for the past 15 minutes, then we're going to have a different call.
No, I did get a lot of it, but towards the end, like I couldn't, uh, like hear you. There were some issues.
Yeah,
But
so
then I'm happy that you touched on all these points with proper clarity, and it was very important. I feel because I had this question. I'm sure many of our audience they also must have had this question, And in today's episode, I think this is something which Jacob likes to talk about, because if he starts talking about something which he likes, you can't stop him in between. So in today's episode, you saw me towards the quieter bit, and Jacob was just going on and on and on.
Yeah, actually,
But yeah, I'm happy.
our plan in the
Yeah,
episode was to talk about this and then get into the rest of the argument stuff. But the issue is like when we say probable, plausible, possible, it may sound like three simple terms. But once you try to break it
yeah,
down, you see that to break it down in layman terms, you have to go into lengthy, as one of my friend calls my audio messages, I had to go into an extempore mode to break it down. Else I could rush
yeah,
through it, and then it's the equivalent of reading a one-line sentence or a one-line definition online. You don't get it in how you
yeah.
can explain to another person. So that's a difficulty. Yeah, so I hope this made sense to our audience. But anyway, I'm quite excited, looking forward to the next episode where we can get into more of the argument, and then it will be more of a back and forth between us as we go step by step, and hopefully we'll have the audio issue sorted out by then.
Yeah. And yeah, as Jacob mentioned, like it's very important that we understand, like the three words sound very similar, and when we think about it, it looks like it's easy to understand, but it's a bit complicated. And when we look at different real life scenarios, different examples around us, it's very difficult to place them. They fall under which category. And definitely, I think after today's episode, most of our audience and myself will be able to do that. So thank you guys for tuning in, and it's been a pleasure to be back again on the podcast. And our playlist, the entire Natural Theology playlist, is available on YouTube. So I recommend that you go ahead and listen to us from episode 1 of this series. And looking forward to the next episode. Follow us on our social media pages so that you'll stay updated. And yeah, that's it from our side. This is Jacob and Ankit signing off.